morning. Our Bible story today is from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 19 through 31. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then his disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was also called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through believing you may have life in his name. The word of God. So good morning. Like Rob, you can tell by my haircut that I am also not Dan. You will also be able to tell because my sermon will be shorter than his, so don't tell him I said that. Thank you all for having me this morning. I'm happy to tap in while Dan and his family are having a much-needed vacation after Holy Week, and so I'm excited to share with you today the story of Thomas. So I'm going to start our time together this morning with a little bit of like a pop survey, okay? And I'm going to ask you to do something that I actually hate doing myself, and so I'm sorry in advance for this, right? The introvert in me hates forced family fun, and so anytime a pastor or any leader is like, "Please raise your hands and do this," I'm like, "Please, can we not?" But I'm going to have us do it this morning anyway. So we're going to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone. If you're feeling a little bit brave this morning, if you will raise your hand if any of these questions resonate with you. How many of you have ever had doubts about anything? Okay, right, good. See, starting off easy, right? This should be an easy one, right? How many of you have had doubts about yourself? So this could be your skills, your instincts, your worthiness. Right, good, okay. How many of you have had doubts about major life decisions? Maybe where you went to school, what your career is, paths, passions you're pursuing. Okay. Now, this next one, I'm going to caveat this. I do not mean your spouse. I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble here. So this question excludes spouses. But how many of you have ever had doubts about relationships, right? So wondering if you are investing in the right friendships, your family connections. If you're a parent, maybe you doubt if you're parenting well, right? Okay, here's a big one. How many of you have ever had doubts about faith? Doubts about God, doubts about Jesus, doubts about the Bible, doubts about our traditions, right? Maybe you've wondered to yourself, did we make this up? Like, are we just so afraid of our own mortality that we've made up religion at all, right? Last question. How many of you have ever been hesitant to express those doubts? Maybe because you would think that someone would have a firmer faith than you, and so you'd be hesitant to share your doubts. Yeah, okay. All right, you can put your hands down. I promise I'm not going to force any more crowd participation, so you all have met your quota for the day. For those of you who have raised your hands, though, you're not alone. This week, I informally surveyed a bunch of people in my life, and I asked them, what kinds of things do you have doubts about? Now, the answers that I got ranged everywhere from doubts in aliens and astrology to doubts in climate change and the government, to even one of my mom friends said, "I doubt that my children will ever be able to put their shoes on the first time I ask them," right? Okay, so like their doubts are everywhere, right? But the most common answer that I got from people when I asked what do they have doubts about was something related to faith. It might have been about God, it might have been about Jesus, it might have been about heaven and hell, but somewhere in the realm of faith, most common doubts I heard this week. Now, that's not just my inner circle. Last year, Barna published a survey that said 50% of practicing Christians expressed doubt in their faith. So that's 50%. Half of us who are actually practicing our faith on a regular, consistent basis are uncertain about the things that we believe in. That doesn't include all of the people outside of the faith practice who may have not had the same engagement with Jesus that we have had. When I think about my own faith journey, this resonates for me. So despite being a Christian for more than 30 years, right, I've had a lot of seasons of doubt peppered throughout my faith journey. I'm what you might call like a nerd. Like I might be what you call like brainy. I'm super practical. I'm a realist. I am enthusiastically academic, right? And so in a battle between my head and my heart, my head always wins, almost always. There might be a couple of times, but it would be an anomaly that my heart would win over my head. I am a person who needs data and source material and like a list of information before I make a decision, right? So I am the kind of person who says, I'll believe it when I see it, right? I very rarely lean on things like hypotheticals or whimsy. I'm high on spreadsheets. Okay? Now, I don't know if you can relate to this, or maybe you have someone in your family or your friend group that can relate to this. But if you can, then you will know that I was a real delight in Sunday school growing up. Okay? As a child, I attended a lot of different churches and denominations, and most of them skewed toward more conservative or evangelical traditions. And my questions there were not always welcome. Okay, some of these questions were, typical, right? Like, did Jonah really get swallowed by a whale? And if so, like, how exactly did that happen? Can someone please tell me? Some other questions that maybe you struggle with: why do bad things happen to good people if God is so loving, right? And then here was a real fun one that got me in trouble. How can we say that a God who is loving sentenced the Jews in the Holocaust to hell? Right? That was not a favorite question that I asked, just so you know, right? I was led to believe that questions like this signified a deficiency in faith. So in my history, it's often been rooted in the notion that if I was just more faithful, more pure, more disciplined, more open, more trusting, more something, that I wouldn't need proof. I would simply believe everything I was told about Jesus and what it means to be a good Christian. Even in seminary, when I was surrounded by scholars and information, had all of that at my fingertips, I couldn't stop myself from asking why. Why is there injustice in the world? Why does the church so often become a place of pain and betrayal? Why does this even matter? Here's the thing about doubt. It creeps up whether you want it to or not. Right? So sometimes doubt shows up like a pebble in your shoe, right? It's a little bit annoying. You can kick it out pretty easily. Sometimes it's a splinter, and it harvests itself in and gets infected, but you can pluck it out with a little bit of work. Sometimes doubt is like an earthquake, and it comes suddenly and it shakes your foundations. And then sometimes it's like a riptide, and it just pulls you out and drags you under, and there's not a lot you can do about it. Here's the beautiful thing about today's story, though. Especially in our man Thomas, it's that Jesus reminds us that there is nothing faithless about doubt. The only way, in fact, to manage doubt is to face it head on. So let's go back to our story in John chapter 20. To set the stage, what happened right before this is that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene at the tomb. He's resurrected, he shows up, and he speaks to her. And do you think that she recognized who he was right away? Do you think she believed that this was the risen Jesus? She did not, right? She thought he was the gardener. Okay, so first appearance, Jesus shows up, and Mary doesn't believe that he is who he says he is. So then he reveals himself to her. He shows himself as Jesus. She believes. She runs over to Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, and she tells them what's happened. I have seen the Lord, she says. Did they believe her? No, they did not, right? They did not. In fact, in Luke 24, the story goes that she went and told the disciples about seeing Jesus, and they basically called her a liar. They said it's an idle tale, right, that she has spun up, right? So Simon and the beloved disciple, they run to the tomb because they want to see for themselves. They've heard the story, and now they need to go and examine. Is there really no body in the tomb? Once they get there and they see that it's empty, then they believe. Now, we've got 3 eyewitnesses. We've got Mary, Simon Peter, the third disciple who doesn't have a name at this point, and they have all now witnessed Jesus firsthand, or sort of firsthand, right? Like they witnessed his body disappeared. So they go back to the rest of the disciples who are hidden away, and they tell them, we have seen the Lord. Now, do those guys believe? It's not a trick question. Do they believe? They don't, okay, right? So if you have not picked up on the pattern yet in the story, here's the spoiler. Not a single person in this story has believed that Jesus was resurrected without needing proof. Not a single person, not one of them has believed it. So, meanwhile, what is happening? The other disciples, they are locked away in a room. Thomas is not there. He's the only one not there. And they are mourning the death of Jesus. So Jesus appears in the room to them. Now, he offers them proof in the story in verse 20. He offers to show them his hands and his side, and then it says they believe, right? I think if I was in a locked room and Jesus just maybe showed up as sort of a ghost, I think I would believe just from that. But Jesus is willing to offer the proof of his crucifixion in order to encourage them to believe. He then, after they have expressed their belief, he offers them peace and charges them with carrying on the mission to make God known in the world through his act of forgiveness on the cross. All right, so let's enter in Thomas now, right? Following Jesus' appearance, the rest of the disciples who've now seen him and have gotten proof that he is resurrected, they give Thomas a call. And what do we think Thomas says? Yeah, right. So he says the same thing everybody else has said up until this point. He says, y'all have lost your minds. Now, to be fair, that's my interpretation of what Thomas says. What he actually says is, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Everyone else up to this point has refused to believe without proof. But Thomas actually calls out the things that he needs from Jesus in order to be convinced, right? So he is saying, I need to actually touch the proof of who Jesus is before I can believe that this is true. Thomas gets sort of a bad reputation in church history for being a doubter. But really, he is not an anomaly in this story. In fact, this is actually all we really know about him. The other 3 Gospels are completely silent about Thomas. So we got a couple of verses about him where his entire personhood is tied up in this need to have proof from Jesus. But what if kind of church history gets it wrong about Thomas? What if, in fact, the doubt is not a problem, but is instead a role model that we should all be looking to? If we go back to the story, a week has gone by. Jesus appears again in the room. We've got our ghostly apparition happening again. And this time, he's solely focused on Thomas. He comes into the space, and before Thomas can even speak, Jesus offers him point for point exactly what Thomas said he needed in order to believe. He offers his hands, he offers his side, and he willingly invites him to touch his body in exchange for Thomas's belief. Now, if you were paying close attention, you might have noticed that Thomas didn't actually touch him, right? Just Jesus' offering, just showing up, Thomas was able to see that Jesus was exactly who he said he was. Now, in the last 3 verses, this is sometimes where we get the story wrong, I think, right? Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe." I think sometimes we think this is an indictment, right? We think that what Jesus is saying is, why did you need to see me in order to believe? But I don't think that's what this is at all. I actually think this is a promise, and it's a promise for us, and here's why. Not a single person in that room believed without having to see Jesus. Not a single person in the story so far has believed without needing proof. But Jesus and the writers of the Bible knew that thousands of years later, we would be here, and we would not be able to be eyewitnesses directly to the story of Jesus. We would not be able to put our hands in his hands and in his side, right? And so we need a different level of faith to be able to believe this story, right? It's a hard pill to swallow, right? Hear me out. This is not an easy thing to be accepting of a risen Jesus, right? But the writers knew that we would need to know that the disciples did not just blindly believe in Jesus. They grappled with his story. The people who were closest to him, his best friends, right? The people who had been in ministry with him still needed proof that Jesus was who he said he was. So that when they told the story later, and for us to read it, we would know that there was some due diligence that occurred, right? This isn't a story about Thomas's unbelief. It's a story about the abundant grace of Jesus who meets Thomas's demands point for point, and it allows us to then find ourselves in the story so that we can be reassured that Jesus has the answers we're seeking. So if you're someone who has ever struggled with the story of Jesus, guess what? You're in good company, right? Half the people in this room raised their hands. Maybe more than half. I didn't count you all, just so you know. But people in this room have expressed doubt and concern about the story of Jesus, right? The best friends and followers in the Bible express doubts about Jesus. The Bible doesn't hide the fact that the men and women who are closest to the action needed evidence of who Jesus was. And this isn't the only story of that. All throughout the Bible, you can experience people who grapple with doubt, whether it is Abraham or Job or the prophets or the psalmists, right? David, Paul, all of them express doubts. And what we can take away from that is that God is a God who is tolerant of doubt and skepticism. Doubt isn't in opposition to our beliefs, but an essential part of it. So, why are we hesitant then to wrestle with doubt? For some of us, it might be because there's vulnerability in doubting. Saying the words, "I don't know," can be uncomfortable. For others, it might be that we're afraid of fear or judgment from those in our community, afraid of the perception that we're questioning in order to justify our own guilt or sin, afraid of losing our faith completely if we look too closely at it. What's ironic about that is that research shows that people who tackle their doubts head on usually end up coming out with stronger beliefs than where they started. One of my favorite modern theologians was a woman named Rachel Held Evans, and she was well known for grappling with doubt and faith. In an interview she held with the author Greg Boyd, she posed this very question to him, and he proposed that the Christian tradition often idolizes certainty. This is what he had to say. The quest to feel certain becomes an idol when a person's sense of significance to God and security before God is anchored not in their simple trust of God's character as revealed on the cross, but in how certain they are about the rightness of their own beliefs. As people who are commissioned to go and tell the story about Jesus to the world, certainty of our story can slide into a desire to be right. We want to be right about this. And so when doubt comes in, that can undermine that feeling of rightness, so we resist it. But if we were to have 100% certainty, there would be no need for faith. Here's the good news, y'all. God can handle our doubt. God can handle our doubt. In the personhood of Jesus, we see over and over and over again the opportunity and invitation to look him straight in the face and pose our questions. We are willingly invited to demand proof of his scars. We are asked to seek the answers we need in order to foster our belief. The evidence of Jesus is there in every account, and we can still see evidence of Jesus' power and peace and love in our lives today. If you are one of the people who might not have any doubts at all, or if you've already wrestled with your doubts and you've come to find Jesus faithful, then just like Mary and Thomas and the rest of the disciples, it's our job to then point people back to Jesus. Jesus wants to hear our doubts. Jesus wants for us to stick our hands in his side so that we can discover that he is exactly who he says he is. Jesus is ready to offer us peace in place of doubt. There are a lot of times in our faith journey, or in the church, or in our community, where we might be let down, where we're going to feel disappointment, or uncertainty, or betrayal, or disconnection, just like the disciples did after the crucifixion of Jesus. But Jesus holds up every time. Every single time, Jesus holds up. Don't be afraid to look at him. In this case, seeing who Jesus is and what he offers actually is believing. So, go forth this week with the love of Jesus and the knowledge that he can withstand every question and every concern and every fear and every doubt that you throw at his feet. Carry with you the assurance that our God is one who will always willingly hold out his hands to you and offer you peace.